Hey guys, it's Mike from the WCA. We're going to take a look at our next instructional video. This position came from one of the 2 o'clock classes from the last session. And basically you're looking at what we call a set position. It's a game from played between two grandmasters, but for teaching purposes we use this. For example, we'll have this set up on a demo board, and we won't move anything for quite a long time, sometimes for more than a half hour or so. And the purpose of set position analysis is what it's called. The main reason we do it is to get everybody involved in the class. So for any of the coaches who are listening to this video or watching it, it's a great tool to get all of your students involved. And basically set position analysis is when you take a chess position that has a lot going on, like the one in front of you does, and you begin to break it down by components. For example, Rusa and I more or less randomly discussed the individual pieces. We started from the most powerful all the way down. So in this position, we looked at the kings first, queens, etc. And then we look at things like pawn structure, activity of the pieces, squares, outposts, lines, and then general observations. So what happens is, as a coach, let's say you have 16, 17 kids in the class. If you break the position down by component, it becomes easier to target the questioning. So for example, in this position, the first thing that we looked at is material, which more or less means who has more stuff. That's easy to do. You basically just have to count the pieces. So here you can choose a student. Let's say you have a rating disparity. You may have several 1600s and there's an 1100 or 1000 in the group. You can start by asking the lowest rated player in the room to answer the material question. And what that does, it's two things. One, you get the student involved. And two, the student actually gets to hear his or her voice in the classroom. And that's important because in any group activity, what often happens is we lay back sometimes, especially if we're not one of the more accomplished players in the room. We lay back because we're embarrassed we're going to make a mistake. But the moment you hear your own voice involved in the discussion, you then become part of the activity. If you sit back and just let the dialogue go on between the other players or students, you tend to feel like you're being left out. So, it's just great advice for anything that you do. Get involved. The moment you hear your voice, you've already got yourself in the mix, and you'll learn so much more. So anyway, we start with material, and again, getting back to the position, you'll see that it's equal here. Then we talked about individual pieces, and here I'll start with the kings. You have to be careful when you talk about the value or the position of a king, because you first have to look at what part of the game are you in. So here you're obviously in, I don't know, this is difficult. Is this the end of the opening or the beginning of the middle game? You're probably right on the edge here because not every minor piece has been developed. If you look at the bishop, and I'll use my mouse pointer here, the bishop down here on c1 hasn't been developed yet. And black hasn't castled. So, I guess you can call this the beginning of the middle game. So when you talk about kings at the beginning of a middle game, you're not so much concerned with the work they're doing, because please don't forget the king is a fighting piece. At the end of a game, for example, the king can march up the board and help you take pawns and promote pawns. Kings can guard squares, guard pieces. They can attack pieces. They're actually great fighters. The only problem is, because of that unfortunate rule of check and checkmate, the king can't go hand to hand with other pieces, especially when they have help, because he'll get in a lot of trouble. So obviously here in this position, we're more concerned with the safety of the kings. So the class that we asked to analyze this position with pretty much agreed that the white king was safer, primarily because he's castled and the black king was not. Because as you know, from the center of the board, there's a greater chance of being attacked. Okay, so after the kings were done, we talked about the queens, and I'll highlight the two queens for you here. And this was pretty much a balanced answer from the kids. And remember, we don't have grandmasters analyzing this position. The highest rated player in this class may not have been over 1200, this particular class. So we're looking for general observations about the queens, and the players pretty much agreed that it was equal. They're on kind of sister squares. If you look at the highlights where the queens are, and again I'll show you with the mouse pointer, that C7 and C2 are kind of symmetrical, and sometimes they call those sister squares. So pretty much equal was the determination about the queens. All right, let's take a look at the rooks. And overall, the class felt that the white rooks were a little bit more active, with the black king being in the center of the board. That disconnects the rooks. And here you can look at the disconnection of the white rooks, again with the mouse pointer. The bishop on C1 can develop connecting the white rooks. The black king pretty much has to castle to connect the two black rooks. And as you'll see later in this game, there's a huge difference between moving this bishop down here on C1 and then getting the king castle. So overall, they gave a slight advantage to the rooks on for white. Now, from a coaching perspective, and again, this is a great tip for any of the coaches that are listening, when you go over these pieces move by move, your students are actually seeing the entire board. For example, let me go back and show you when we compared the kings. By looking at the kings here, this whole zone that I'm circling, that's called the white king side of the board, right? So then if you were then to start looking at the squares surrounding the black king, you're going to start realizing that now all of a sudden you're starting to analyze the center of the board. And let's go back to the two queens. I'll highlight those for you. They're on the queen side of the board, and the queen side of the board is generally defined as these three files, A, B, and C, and the king side is usually F, G, and H, and the two in the middle, as I'm toggling up the board, is the center. So looking at the two white queens, or the two queens in general, I'm sorry, you're now looking at the queen side of the board. So just by these random observations, your eyes tend to look at the whole board, which is just a great habit for your students to get into. All right, lastly, we talked about the minor pieces, and it was kind of hard to determine which ones were better because of the pawn structure, and I'll get into that more in a moment. But overall, they gave an advantage to white, namely the knight up here on D7 seems to be a little more passive than his partner here on F3. The dark squared bishop, and hopefully you guys can see this mouse pointer, is kind of restricted by his own pawn. And this bishop on C6 doing a pretty nice job. It's controlling a lot of light squares. So overall, they gave a slight edge to the white minor pieces. Okay, so now next we talked about pawn structure, and I'll light those guys up for you. Boy, we could do a ton of videos just talking about the value of knowing pawn structure. And all that means is simply the shape of the pawns. You can think of pawn structure much like an athlete might think of a different field that they're playing on. For example, if you're playing soccer and you're playing on artificial turf, that's very, very different than playing soccer on a muddy field. So imagine you're playing in a game and you had some pretty heavy rain the day before. Well, that's a very, very different terrain or field than if you were playing indoors with artificial turf. The pawn structure basically tells you what kind of field you're playing on. So if you can imagine, a lot of the pawns you're looking at right now have disappeared, then the board is now wide open. If the board is wide open, the field you're playing on is different. Pieces like bishops and rooks and queens love open boards because they have a lot of space. So one of the first observations you can teach your students is look at the pawns, because they're going to tell you where the pieces can and cannot go. There's a problem here with this pawn structure. It makes it difficult for both players. The key observation that they came up with here, and we were very impressed because, again, the highest rated player in the room may have been 1200, was that the pawn structure was not locked. The pawns are mobile, especially the two white pawns in the middle, and because they can move, it creates a lot of opportunity on the next move. For example, if it's white's move in this position, you don't know what they're going to do with those pawns. Are they going to move a pawn to E5, and I'll show you again with the mouse pointer? Are they going to play D5? Are they going to take on C5? Is this C pawn here going to move up for some reason? And because there are so many possibilities with the pawns, it's unclear the kind of field the players are going to be working with. And that was one of the key factors in how this game turned out. Okay, so after discussing the pawn structure, the players then took a chance or have the chance to make general observations. And again, as a coaching tip, especially if you're ever doing curricular chess, where chess becomes part of the classroom activity, this is a golden opportunity to get even rank beginners, I mean kids who can just barely move the pieces, to get them involved in your discussions. If you ask a kid who knows the rules of chess to look at this position on a demo board or on a computer screen and just give general observations, you'll find that the pattern recognition is amazing. It may not necessarily be good chess, because obviously they don't have the background for that, but their ability to spot patterns and to make general observations about squares and colors of squares and what certain things look like to them are great advantages for teachers, because once you hear those kids give you those explanations, you now know that you have things to work for in the future. For example, if they give you something very interesting, but you know it's not a good chess move, then your job as a coach is to bring their overall sense of structure up to their chess ability. And that's a tough thing to do, but it's also giving you a good plan. Okay, at this point, it became time to talk about one, whose move it was. It turns out to be White's. And then, how are we supposed to find a move? Well, a room full of 1,200 rated chess players with enough of this analysis came up with the key difference between the two positions. And that was namely the location of the kings. White, it turns out it is White's move in this position, realized that they needed to take advantage of the fact that the black king hasn't castled yet. And to do that, they had to create some sort of trouble or threat, something that would prevent the black king from castling. And the key to do it was to make the move d5. Now, when you play the move d5, you're going to create, let me see if I can highlight this for you. Yeah, there it goes. You're going to create an issue in the center of the board. By putting that pawn on d5, you're actually threatening the bishop, you're threatening the other pawn on e6, and all of those squares around that pawn are now either open or being attacked. That's going to create problems for the king. If you play, for example, let me take this back. If White, instead of pushing the pawn, what if White took the pawn on c5? Because remember, from this position, it's White's turn. White could have made the obvious capture. That would have been a mistake, because by capturing the pawn, you're allowing perhaps Black's weakest minor piece to come into the game. And not only has that knight come into the game, Black now has a threat. So if you want, you can pause your video and see if you can spot Black's threat. So for example, let's say White just makes a random move and plays h3. Hopefully you came up with the move bishop a4. And all of a sudden, White goes from having a very good position to being in trouble. Okay, so let's go back to d5. In this position, the move d5 stops Black from castling because the bishop on c6 is being attacked. So there isn't that much of a choice. You could retreat the bishop to b7, and then what White would do is start creating more trouble near the king. For example, let's take a pawn on e6. Black takes their pawn back, and I highlighted the pawn because now the pawn on e6 becomes a target. It's not protected, it's in the middle of the board, so let's say White attacks it instantly, and Black decides to hang on to the pawn by moving their king to f7. That would connect their rooks, and the problem is the location of the king is not terrific. For example, with a move like bishop c4, creating that battery, if you decide to protect that pawn with a move like knight f8, you'll quickly realize that your pieces are getting pushed back, and this is not going to turn out well for you. You don't want to play with your pieces on the back rank and your king exposed the way it is here. So going back after d5, black decides not to allow that and simply takes. So again, the theme we want you to follow through the whole game is how white never allows black to castle and keeps putting pressure on their position. So by taking back, black is faced with the same problem they had a move ago. The bishop on c6 is being attacked, so they take the pawn. Now, this is a pure pawn sacrifice. White has given up a pawn. But again, the key to remember is why. With all that analysis they did, white felt the main difference between their position and black's was the location of the king. That gave them something to work for. How do I keep the black king in the center? Well, by sacrificing this pawn, I've now placed this bishop that I'm circling with the mouse pointer in the middle of the board. If I highlight it for you, you'll notice that it's not protected, and we call those loose pieces. So what white does is moves their bishop to b5, and that exposes this rook here on d1 to the bishop on d5, creating another threat. And black has some problems to solve here. There are several moves that could have been played. One line that we looked at here was simply retreating the bishop back. You have to be careful because moving the bishop to the wrong square is going to get you in a whole heap of trouble here. For example, let's take a look at the move. Let's look at bishop e6 first. The bishop gets away from the rook. The problem is, you'll see what's highlighted now, and that's the rook in the corner, and all of a sudden white's pieces can start coming out with threats. So for example, you attack that rook, let's say it goes to d8, and now because your queen is here on e4, that affords you an opportunity to play the move bishop f4, hitting the queen with a tempo, and all of white's pieces are starting to come out, and you'll notice that the black king is still stuck in the center. You can look at a move like bishop c6, which was a move, actually it may have worked out better than the way the game did, but bishop c6 and white can still continue playing some a real aggressive play. How about a move like bishop f4? Yeah, that's right. I'll circle it. It's not protected, and the queen can just obviously take it. But if she does, white will get their piece back by taking on c6, and by doing that, now you're hitting the rook, and you're attacking this knight on d7 twice. One way to protect it, this is kind of a cool move, is you could actually castle queenside. But black probably doesn't want to go in for this, and this is also very, very instructive. I'll put up a couple of highlights to explain to you why most grandmasters don't want to have this position as black. For example, let's highlight the two bishops. You'll notice that they're on opposite colors. At the end of a chess game, just having bishops with opposite color can turn a lot of pawn endings into draws because the two bishops can't battle one another. In a middle game like this, especially when there are open squares around the king and there are lots of powerful pieces left, bishops of opposite color usually favor the attacking team, because if you're attacking, for example, on the light squares, the other bishop can't participate in the defense. So sometimes white could attack here and feel like they're a piece up. Let's put another highlight here for you. Look at the files that are open. Both of those files kind of have the king caught in the middle. Again, in the long term, that can be a real issue as you start opening more lines around the king. And finally, let's look at all these light squares that I've highlighted for you. They call those a color complex. Think of a group of all white squares in one zone. A lot of chess players and authors call those complexes. You'll notice that those white squares are terribly weak and open, and the white bishop is already attacking that that structure. So black certainly doesn't want to go in for something like this. So let's take a look at what he actually did. He attacked the bishop back. which was an interesting move because he's basically telling white, listen, you take my bishop, I'll take yours, and I don't mind getting a couple of pieces off the board. It may actually relieve some of the pressure against my king. As a matter of fact, if we trade everything here, I might just castle and be able to get away with that. So white doesn't want to allow that. So again, here you can pause your video and see if you can find the move that white came up with to keep the game sharp and to keep the initiative. Okay, one of the main responses we got was to take the knight here on d7. Now that's the most forcing move you can play. It's a capture and a check, so black pretty much has to answer you. Obviously not with the king. They're going to take with the queen, and a lot of the kids thought in this position that this was the correct path that white should take because of the move c4. And that pins the bishop, and it looks like you're going to win a piece. But as it turns out, black is going to be slightly better in this position. So again, you can pause your video from this position and see if you can find how black got out of this pin. Okay, the answer was bishop to e4. So after bishop to e4, both queens are attacked. So if you go in for the trade, for example, say rook takes queen, bishop takes on c2, black is actually better in this position. The king is still stuck in the middle, but there are some problems here for white. Namely, the rook on d7 is attacked by the king, so the king goes from being this very weak piece that's being attacked to the attacker himself. And another key observation here is the fact that black has two bishops. Go a little further and look at the terrain you're playing on. Look at the pawn structure. Not only does black have an extra pawn, but there are no center pawns left on the board. And all of the WCA students have learned that a great rule of thumb is to always know the number of center pawns that are on the board, because that'll let you know the value of the bishop pair. It doesn't work 100% of the time, but it's very close. Here, because the board is wide open, those bishops are going to have a chance to really run. Okay, so after bishop f4, black decides to take. And after they take, white gets the piece back, but first by taking on d7 with check. And it's important to take that because after the king takes back, you get your piece back here. You'll notice that the king has now been stranded in the center of the board. Well, where to go? Not an easy choice. A move like king c6 is possible, but then perhaps rook f5 hitting the queen, queen d6 to get away from that, and then a move like rook d1, and all of a sudden all of the white pieces are all over again. So that's going to be a problem. So after check, black decides to put the king on c7. All right, we have to continue playing thematically, and that means playing according to the theme. What was the theme? Keep the king in the center. Okay, we've done that. Now what? Well, to keep him on the run, you have to make moves that create threats, because if you look carefully, you're still down a pawn as white. You don't want to give black an opportunity to get their pieces activated, namely the two rooks in the corner. Let me circle those for you. You got one up here on h8, the other on a8. They're not participating. If you can keep those guys out of the action, there's an excellent chance you're going to either mate the black king or win some material. So we can't play slow moves. So again, anytime you can pause the video and try to guess the move that was being played. White plays rook to e1, hitting the bishop, and it doesn't make it easy for the rooks to get involved because it seems so natural just to swing a rook over and protect it. But you'll notice that after a move like this, doubling the rooks, the bishop is pinned. And it's pinned because obviously if you move it, you're going to lose a rook up here because there are two white rooks attacking it. You play a move like queen f6 to protect everything, and here comes our queen to e4 move. This is, in chess jargon, they call this a centralized queen. This is such a monster. I mean, this piece is so strong. There's a triple battery pointing at the bishop. The rook on a8 is being attacked by the queen. All of black's pieces are being tied up. So when this bishop here, in this position, move there, let's go back for a moment after rook e1. What if it had gone to f6? That was another possibility. Well, take a look at the move rook e4. That attacks the queen. And then we have to ask the queen a question. Basically, where is she going? And it looks like she's trapped. And it's pretty hard to do, to trap a queen near the center like that, but you've done exactly that. So black would have been in big trouble. So that's why after this move, rook e1, black just decides to move the bishop. And again, follow the sequence, the patterns that white's playing. I'm not going to give black a chance to rest. I'm going to use my active pieces to create threats. Rook f5. Hits the queen and the pawn on f7. If you grab this pawn here that I'm circling at some point, that's going to be check. You take something with check, it's going to be your move again, because your partner won't be able to improve their position. They're going to have to get out of check. Okay, so after rook f5, queen goes to c4, and white continues with rook e4. Notice every move comes with a threat or a major improvement of the pieces, usually both. So here, the rook is not only threatening the queen, but now it has the ability to slide back and forth. This is known as a rook lift, and gain time because black cannot improve their position. Black has to move the queen. Okay, so she decided to go to b5 in this position. Rook takes f7 check, and here the king is almost forced to the back row. Some kids suggested the move king c6, which feels natural enough, but moves like rook e6 not only pin the bishop, but they start to open up all the light squares near the king. And for example, here we'll just make a move for black, creating an escape square for the king. A move like queen d3 is now kind of sealing his escape area. There's no escape from this position. Knight to e5 is coming. There's all sorts of mating threats. You can pause the video and go through them yourselves. But if that king takes a step up here on c6, he's going to get in big trouble. So back to rook f7, he decided to go to b8. And here comes rook e6. And it's just amazing how every single move white plays creates a threat. Black decides to protect the bishop with rook to d8, getting all the pieces, trying to get them active, although here they're basically just babysitting their friends. And here's another great attacking concept. A lot of us below the master level make the mistake of thinking, we get into this pattern of attack, and keep making threats, and then there comes a time where you still have to make attacking moves, but the purpose of the attack is slightly different. White attacks the queen again, but the beauty of this attacking move, it's not just to gain time, but it's to knock the queen to a square that's really uncomfortable. She's running out of squares big time as well. So by forcing her to c6, you're taking her not only out of play, but you're putting her into this position of, man, I'm getting pinned again. This is not fun. So for example, if she had gone to a5, how about making a threat? How about a move like queen a4? So you have that threat over there on b7, and you can't defend that so easily. The most natural thing to do is to guard it with a rook, expecting a trade, and then you run into rook takes d6. And all of a sudden, black's in huge trouble. It looks like you can take either one of the white rooks, and we'll leave it up to you guys on your boards to figure out what happens if black does that. It's not going to turn out well. Okay, so going back, the queen retreated to c6, and here another concept of great attacking chess was introduced. Use every piece you can. So who haven't we heard from in terms of, or from the white army? And that would be the knight here on f3. right here. And in the game, white jumps into e5, taking advantage of the pin, attacking the queen, gaining more time, and the queen unfortunately gets pushed back to c8. And here we call this the killer blow, or the final shot, or the the move that wins the game. And these are tough to find in real games because over the board with a clock ticking in a tournament, usually your heart's pounding, you're really excited, and you have to make sure that your emotion doesn't run too far and you try to look to do something really fancy. But because you have black in such a defensive setup, if you take the time, you'll find the remaining weakness in black's position. And white plays such a cool move. I remember Rusa saying it's her favorite move in the game. And well, you can pause your video and see if you can find it. There are several moves here that'll probably win for you. But in the game, white plays queen to b1. And why it's such a cool move is that the queen actually retreats to a move that creates an unstoppable threat. You can't really defend that pawn up there on b6. So in the game, black actually resigned. However, in the class, somebody explained or suggested the move b5, which does stop the queen from taking it, but you just take with your c pawn, and now you're threatening to just take this again and open the line and mate the king. And if he pushes past you, then black gets hit with, knight c6. And after knight c6 check, queen takes, pawn takes, discovered check, king c8, and queen b7 mate. Okay, guys, as we always advise you to do, go through the video again, set up a chessboard if you'd like, put it up next to you, pause the video as many times as you want. That's certainly one way to get the most out of the video. Another way to do it is watch it again and just let the moves kind of gloss over your eyes. Don't try to memorize anything. Just make sure that when you walk away, you understood the key theme to the game, which was not to let the black king castle, and how exactly white took advantage of that. All right? Okay, keep up the work, and we'll see you guys next week in class.